Hi, I'm Anne Lamott, and I'm so happy to be here for the official launch party of Elissa Altman's fabulous new memoir, Permission. She's the author of three memoirs, Motherland Trafe and Poor Man's Feast. She's a longtime contributor to the Washington Post, to the Guardian, to the Oprah magazine, and so forth. And this new book is something every writer needs. Um, the question writers ask themselves is, who am I to tell my story? How do we give ourselves permission to write the stories that have been building inside of us that we're compelled to tell, especially when we're told we shouldn't and mustn't? So we have faced over and over again this dire question that we want to write about this stuff, but that we may be shunned by our family, we may be threatened, we may be canceled by our family. Even if what you want to write has defined them in your worldviews, you may have a finger waggling at you saying you absolutely may not tell it. But what if you do? So, Permission is one part memoir, one part master course on how to begin and keep going when you've been told you can't, and to give yourself permission to try all kinds of creative writing, of writing about what you deeply and truly want to, about transformation, of freedom. It's a way of finding a path past the constraints of shame and fear into understanding and recognition of the ethics of soul saving, your very own. So I am thrilled to have you here, Elissa, for your big book party. Yay!
Thank you so much. I wish I was there in person celebrating with you, but this is wonderful, and I'm really grateful that you
Oh, I do.
that you're here.
I have loved your work for a long time, and then we met
Oh, thank
when
you.
a dear mutual friend passed, and you came to me, and you were the only person besides me that felt as bad as I did, and that was even taking the time to grieve it and talk about the passing of a great writer, um,
Mm.
Molly.
Molly
Um,
O'Neill, I miss her
Molly
every day.
O'Neill, the food writer at
Yeah,
the New York Times, and it just seemed like it was passing everybody by, that everybody was busy with their own stuff, and you and I were like, it's the end of the world. Molly died. We
yeah.
can't
It
bounce
was
back, but that was how you and I met, and I've loved every book of yours so far, and especially I think this one. I just love them all for different reasons. But after teaching memoir for a decade and writing three memoirs of your own, how did you come to write this book? Can you tell us the story behind it?
yes. So in 2013, my first memoir came out, and that was Poor Man's Feast.
Mm-hmm.
And in Poor Man's Feast, which was a sort of a simple linear love story about meeting the woman who would become my wife and making the decision to leave New York City and move to rural Connecticut. I moved from the city to a town of 3,500 people. I was completely head over heels, obviously. And the book basically recounts our meeting and our first year together and our families. There's some backstory. And the core of the story is sustenance. How do we sustain ourselves? Why do we choose certain things to sustain ourselves? How did I get to a place where I was a food writer, and I had grown up in a home where my father was crazy about food, and he was an amazing cook, and he sort of lived food. And my mother hates food and still hates food to this day. But that was the question, was how and why was I what why did I find myself in this position? And I traced it back to the story of my paternal grandmother, who in 1926, at the age, I want to say, of 23, um, left the family and left my father and my aunt, who was 3 at that point, and my
Mm-hmm.
aunt, who was 8, and my grandfather. And she did come back 3 years later, but during that absence, I mean, my father was craving sustenance. He was craving love. He was craving maternal care, which he was not obviously not getting at that point. And my grandmother was actually a very, very good cook. So anyway, so I, in 8 lines at the back of this book, I thought they were innocuous, and I wrote this story in 8 lines. And a couple of months later, I found myself basically disowned by that side of my family. And the reason was, in my family growing up, that was a story that was like told at the dining room table. That was how my father metabolized it. He told it over and over again. He talked about it when we walked the dog. I mean, he talked about it all the time. And what I didn't know was that my aunt never told her family, never told her kids. I think one of them kind of knew, but never told her kids, never told her grandkids, um, and certainly didn't tell her extended family. And so they were completely blindsided. And it was not pretty. It was really not pretty. And I learned very quickly what the ramifications can be. I mean, this is sort of a worst case scenario, but what the ramifications can be if you write something that you're not supposed to write. And then you talk about something that you're not supposed to talk about. And for me, I mean, it was a secret, but nobody bothered to tell me that it was a secret. So I had no idea. These were people I loved, who I was very, very close to. And it's been a really difficult decade. It was 2013, and I didn't really talk about it, or write about it at all until 2016, where I couldn't not write about it anymore, because it seemed to me that this really was the elephant in the room for new writers, for seasoned writers. How do we deal with stories that we're not supposed to tell, but that absolutely define us, that touch us, that make us who we are, and that define who we are.
Mm-hmm. And I wrote a story about my mom in Traveling Mercies. We both had pretty troubled mothers, pretty troubled relationships with pretty
Yeah.
troubled mothers. And in my case, and my mom was just such a handful, but I loved her and I took incredible care of her. And I got this crazy idea that if I wrote a story about the truth, which was that it was kind of a mixed grill. I mean, not that it was a mixed grill, that both of us drove each other crazy. And I would tell this story, and it would include love. It would include, how much my son took care of her and didn't see what a nightmare. I mean that nicely. Didn't see what a nightmare she was. Just wanted to help her not lose her balance and stuff. And so, I wrote this story, and the shit hit the fan. And her twin sister wrote and said, "Annie Lamott, you cannot be forgiven for this."
Oh
And
my
the
God.
town where we grew up is called Tiburon. It used to be a tiny little railroad town. The town where we grew up had a newspaper called The Ark, and they wrote editorials about me,
No,
on and on.
no.
And they were
Oh,
getting about what Anne Lamott had done to that brave, courageous um, community helper, and you know somebody who had done so much for the town to help, and on and on and on. And finally, my priest friend, Bill Rankin, who you know about, who I've written a lot about, he wrote a letter to the Ark, and he said, if any of you had ever seen the way Anne Lamott takes care of her mother, it would shame you. But it was a firestorm because I wasn't allowed to say that it was really hard for us to love and accept each other, and we did the best we could, and that is the ultimate story of family grace. And
absolutely.
but
Yeah.
I knew I didn't have the right, I didn't have permission to ever write about her again, But then I did, because at some point she wasn't really able to follow anymore. But yeah, I mean, this book is so profound in encouraging and exhorting people to tell the stories that are like pulse beats inside of us, that want to be told, and that we
Yeah.
try to rationalize as, well, not right now, I don't think, da 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 da. And the book is about, do it afraid. Just do it, because you're meant to,
Yeah.
because it wants you to tell it, because it's truth, and all you have to share with us is your own version of the truth here, your little snippet of it, your clips, your movie clips
Yeah.
of what you've seen and lived through and experienced and surmounted and felt defeated by and come through. So, and everybody, I mean, there's nearly 500 people listening to us right now, and all of them at 600, at some point, most of them have wanted to tell their stories. And it's been
That's
so
right.
scary, because when we were 4 and 5, we agreed not to. When you're going to
That's
go
right.
out, when you're going to leave the house and go to kindergarten, it's made very clear that what happens in the house or Las Vegas stays in the house or Las
That's right.
Vegas.
That's
And
right.
it's just so, it's like, if you tell these stories, the long bony finger is going to come down from the sky, and you're doomed. Because
Yeah, that's right.
you signed the contract that you would never tell the truth of your
That's right.
family. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it's as I mean, that's a remarkably painful story about your paper, about your local paper. I mean, I can't even imagine. I mean, I can imagine, but it's really a surprising and shocking thing, I think, when people are invested in being right, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And I mean, we know that this is like a fact of humanity, and they have to be right, and they have their stories have to be the right versions, and um but in this case, secrets are secrets, and I didn't know it was a secret. Nobody told me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I didn't grow up in the other house.
Uh-huh,
My cousins
uh-huh.
were much older than I. Um, but and my dad talked about it all the time, and I
Mm-hmm.
often I lost him in 2002,
Mm-hmm.
and I often think about what would he have said had he read that. And part of the reason why I wrote it was because I wanted to give my grandmother back her voice,
Mm-hmm.
like many women who make the painful decision to leave their families for whatever reason. She was made into a pariah, and
Mm-hmm.
even though she came back, no one, and I think to this day, no one has asked, why did she go? Why did she leave?
Mm-hmm.
Who
Mm-hmm.
was she?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and those were all questions that I was carrying in me for years, for
Mm-hmm.
years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love thrillers and novels, but for somebody, a really good writer, to tell me a really good story is what I'm in it for at all. Like, I remember I was probably about 20 when I read Beryl Markham's West with the Night, and I thought, this
Hmm.
is what I want to do when I grow up. I want to have a
Yeah.
story to tell. And you don't know, because the culture's so shaming, that if, like Flannery O'Connor said, if you've survived childhood, you have enough to write about for the rest of your life,
That's
right? But
very
because
true.
you've been told you can't tell it. So what are you
Yeah.
supposed to tell? It's your story, it's your truth. And you need
Right.
to push back your sleeves and take a maybe slightly frightened, quavery breath, and just start writing really badly. And
Right.
the shitty first draft, and it'll start to
Hmm.
get better and better. It's so wild to rebel against all the BS we were told about who we were when we were young, that we internalized, that what we were allowed to do or not do, especially women. I mean, I grew up in the 50s, and the bandwidth for a woman was so narrow,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so, I mean, it's exhilarating to start telling the truth, and it's shocking.
It
Um,
is.
yeah, it's shocking and it's thrilling, and I wonder right now if you might give us a taste of your book, to give us a reading.
Sure, thank you. So this is just a short reading from the introduction, which is called "There Was a Secret." I did not know that it was a secret, and this not knowing changed my world, tilted it on its axis, spun it like a top. It broke my life and broke my health, and it broke my spirit. It threatened my marriage. I began to stutter the way I had as a child. It altered my creative course, took my humor, rendered me silent for almost a decade. It left me sleepless and afraid. It inflated my ego and then burnt it to ash. It unraveled my understanding of love and tribe and the meaning of grace. Toward the end, when I could no longer do the things that breathe air and light into my days, I couldn't write or work. I couldn't play guitar. I couldn't feed or support myself or the woman I love. I couldn't care for my health or my spirit. And I came close enough to the edge to peer over it. The non-secret secret saved me. Definition: a non-secret secret. A story that everyone knows and everyone hides. A story that everyone knows and pretends never happened. A story that everyone knows and then forgets with the passage of time. A story that some people know and some people don't. A story encased in shame like a chrysalis. A story that defines and traumatizes generations past and generations to come, guts them, and requires utter allegiance to someone else's truth. Here is a story that had been spoken of daily in my childhood home. I heard it morning and night for almost 18 years until I left for college, and then during college, and again when I returned home. The story had been part of our daily household conversation, like the weather or the news. This story had always been there, like wallpaper. What happens when a family is devastated by a tragic story and the other half buries it? Like my father, I carried the non-secret secret with me viscerally. It was the basis for every decision that my father made throughout the course of his life, and in the end, it was the story that changed everything I, too, thought about memory, shame, truth, permission, risk, writing, teaching, and making art. Early on, writes Jane Ann Phillips in her essay, Outlaw Heart, writers were awarded a possession of a set of truths enlisted to protect someone's version, yet we lived in the context of those stories and we understood the truth to shift. And from the earliest days, when I imagined that I might become a writer, this was the story I knew I had to unravel, unpack, attempt to fathom. This was the story that I had to understand in order to keep, paraphrasing Phillips, sorrow from being meaningless.
That's beautiful, Elissa.
Thank you.
Keep sorrow from being meaningless.
Yeah.
I once wrote somewhere that if people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better.
Mm-hmm.
In Permission, you argue that there are gray areas having to do with revenge writing. It's funny, Ethan Kanan, the wonderful novelist who teaches at Iowa, told me 30 years ago, he said, you should never write out of revenge. And I have told tens of thousands of students over the years, they need no other reason. But that's just me. I think. Anyway, there are these gray areas having to do with revenge writing, risk, motivation, responsibility, and intent. Where do you stand on knowing when something has gone too far or when you've pushed the limits of that?
Yeah. By the way, I have that quote tacked up on my bulletin board. I've been considering getting a tattoo, another tattoo. Seamus Heaney on one arm and
Yeah.
Lamott on the other arm.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that innately we have a sense. If George Saunders talks about listening to the work and listening to what it has to tell you and listening to your stories as you're writing them and listening to the characters. And, I think that, for me, taking a giant step back and thinking, is this revenge writing? I mean, am I doing this because I want to get back at someone? In I want to say it was my second book. I wrote it. That was Trafe. I wrote it and I submitted it to my editor. And there was a chapter in it that had 40 pages of sort of, clothing tearing, breast beating, revenge. I can only be described as revenge writing. And I sent it off to her, and she sent it back to me, and she said, "This is great, but it's not going in the book." It's not going in the book. It was like big delete. So 40 pages kind of got, cutting room floor. And I begged and I pleaded and I said, "This is part of the story." And she said, "No, it's not. It's part of your internal story, but it is not part of this story." Mm-hmm. And what it's going to do is it's going to pull the reader off track. It's going to pull the story off track. It's going to render the characters flat and inhuman. It smacks of looking for perfection, and we know what you say about, perfection, that will keep us manic and, cramped and uncomfortable and crazy our whole lives, which is right. And so, for me, what I do is if I have to get it out of my system, and sometimes I do have to get it out of my system, I'll do it. But I then have to take a giant step back and I reread everything I write as I write it, and I read it aloud. And I also read it to my wife, who is a very good conscience. And she knows if I've gone too far. Everything, though, is a risk, everything that when we're writing about family. I mean, you can write about, Aunt Dolores's roast chicken and hear from her daughter in the worst possible way. It's impossible to predict. It's impossible to predict. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But you kind of know.
Yeah.
You kind of know. Yeah.
I would never write or publish something that was an attack on somebody who was living, except for Donald Trump and Elon Musk. But
right.
I am, both of us are just so super sensitive and sort of codependent that it's not going to be something that comes up often or easily, that we would write something that would be devastating for the person to read it. Now, one thing I wrote about this in Bird by Bird is that if you change people's hair color and height, they never recognize themselves, and you can use what they've said and done verbatim. Now, I had a friend 30 years ago, and everything she said, she was very, very efficient and officious, and every single thing she said was negative. Everything. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could say, "Oh, it's such a beautiful blue sky today," and she'd talk about melanoma, ocular melanoma. It was like this bizarre word association game. And, you could talk about a bird song, and she'd talk about, diseases you could get in bird poo. And it was fascinating. So in my third novel, which was called Jo Jones, I wrote about her, and her nickname was the world's most negative person. And I used some of her direct quotes, I mean, I remember once I said, "What are you reading?" And she said, "Oh, I'm reading H.G. Wells and History of the World." And I said, "How early does it start?" And without missing a beat, she said, "Slime." Just like that. So I wrote about that, and I quoted that in the book, in Jo Jones. And she was, and we were walking along, we were taking a walk in Tiburon actually once, and she'd read the book and she loved it. And I said, "Oh, yeah." And she said, "God, that Faye is so wild." And then she said, "I know someone exactly like that." And I
Oh my
said,
God.
I think we all do. But so you can write. I had a student in one of my workshops who a young Asian boy, man. He was like in his 20s, and his mother, to punish him when he had misbehaved or gotten a bad grade, would hold his hand over the flame. And this was the central experience of his life, and he wanted to write about it, and he didn't want to hurt his mother, right?
Sure.
And so I didn't want him to write a memoir and it blow. She's like 75-year-old woman, 70 or whatever she would have been. And I said, that's what fiction exists. That's why fiction exists. That
Yeah, yeah,
you make her be the Italian across the street who's 5'8", and blonde
yeah.
and not Asian. I want people to know that if they hear terrifying screaming in the background that you are safe and it's just one of your cats.
It's just Arthur. It's just Arthur. Arthur has a
Okay.
lot to say about everything.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
and
no
he's
one needs
deeply
to worry.
no, deeply disturbed about the political situation. So yeah, he's
Yeah.
right.
So if you need permission, not a novel is all you need, but your book is about writing memoirs, but also you can just change what people look like and their
Hmm.
height and their hair color, and they never notice that it's them.
That's so funny.
It's true. It's true. Um, so you talk about permission and story ownership as
Hmm.
being the elephant in the room of memoir. What's been your experience working with memoirists who are just stuck in the quicksand of fear and shame and just cannot move forward? How do you help your students take that first scary step?
Yeah, it's everybody comes in in their own place. I mean, this. They come in wanting to write whatever it is they need to write, and it often comes off as being sort of dire. I have to write this story. I have to write the story. And story ownership is a really funky thing. I mean, I always talk about, you put five adult siblings around a dining room table and you say, do you remember that Christmas in 1975 when Dad got drunk on the Jim Beam? And you will get a different response from each of them, including one who will say, Dad never drank.
Right.
And those are all individual truths. They're all valid individual truths. And but there's only one fact. There's only one empirical fact. But of those truths, each person is going to insist and fight to the death that they are right. And God forbid you write something that conflicts with that. And that is story ownership. Everybody feels that their version is the right version. And again, we are, humans are heavily invested in being right. Um, so, just aside, I mean, I once had a very well-known novelist come into one of my workshops, completely freaked me out to see her there, but there she was. And she, brilliant writer, wrote amazing, a great contributor to the workshop. And at the end of the class, I said to her, what are you going to do with this? What's the next step? And she said, well, I could never get this I could never publish this. And I said, why not? And she said, well, it would just hurt my family so much. And I said, well, where are they? And she said, dead for 150 years. So, that's story ownership. That's like,
Yeah.
the bleeding claws
Yeah. Yeah.
hanging on for dear life. That's the Tevia's wife coming from coming out of the grave and Fiddler on the Roof. I mean, that's what that is. But, I ask my students to, search their hearts and search their souls about the thing that they must tell. I also tell them that if a story has touched you directly, has impacted you, has changed your worldview, has made you who you are, that story is yours to write. If it is a story that is just a great story and a really interesting story, but it's about someone else, and it's sort of isolated from the thing that you're writing, and you isolated from your narrative. Then things start to get murky. But if it has touched you, it has changed your life, it's made you who you are, like the texture of your hair and the color of your eyes, it is your story.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So you start where you are. I always tell my students,
Yeah,
I always have them keep a 1-inch picture frame on their desks. And because they think now that they're going to tell the story, they need to know how it's going to turn out. But how could they know how it's going to turn
right.
out because they haven't written it? So I always had my students give each other 1-inch picture frames. Here's mine, from,
Yep, I've got one too. Actually,
yeah,
it's
from
right on
30
my
years
bookcase.
ago,
Yeah.
because all you
Yeah.
need to do, especially starting out, is anything, any scene, any passage, any memory, any conversation, any description that you can see through your 1-inch picture frame. And the bad
Yeah.
voices inside of you, the inner critic is going to say, "Oh, well, what does that have to do with anything?" Or "Who cares?" Usually, "Who cares?"
So
And you,
what? Right.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And all
Right.
you can
Right.
do is think, "I don't know, you're probably right," and then pick up the 1-inch picture frame and tell the next one. And
Yeah.
it's like stringing beads on a necklace. Pretty soon you got something.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah. That's
and
right.
then, yeah, it's like that old cliche that you can fix bad, but you can't fix nothing, you know?
That's very good. That's a good point. Yes. Yeah.
So, is everything fair game? How can a writer well, you sort of answered that you can't predict the response that their work will get. Is it ever not worth it to tell your stories and to tell the truth?
I think that if something is, I think if something is really going to devastate someone, I think it can get murky. I think it can get murky,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and getting back to the issue of revenge and risk, we have to search our hearts for not only our truth but our intent and
Mm-hmm.
motivation in telling
Mm-hmm.
the stories. Why are we doing it? What are we trying to answer? What question are we trying to? What thing are we trying to unravel? And one hopes that when we get to the end of the thing that we're writing, we are more compassionate towards whomever, including ourselves, our own characters. We have to reach a certain place of understanding and transcendence. I mean, that's sort of my foundation for the memoirs that I write. I have to understand something at the end that I didn't understand going in. And I think that if someone is going to sit down and write, whatever it is they need to write, that's a dire thing, they have to always ask themselves, what is my intent? What is my motivation here? And only writers know, if that intent and that motivation is worthy.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to say to get back at somebody, I actually had a student once say that to me in a class. I asked everybody, why are you doing this? What's the reason? And everybody told everyone various stories, and then the guy in the the guy in the class said, well, to get back at somebody, why else would I do it? And that's sort of very like, I don't know
Yeah,
about
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah,
that's kind of questionable. Yeah.
yeah. But do you think that writers should create their narratives with possible reader response in mind? Because I don't. I think
Yeah.
questions about how your work is going to be received is the biggest block to writing.
Mm-hmm.
And that, not to sound like the Nike ad, but you just sort of have to just do it. And
Mm-hmm.
then you can ask someone, you could ask your wife or somebody in your writing group, or everybody here should know about Sam and Reese's writing collective, which is called awritingroom.com. It's not thewritingroom.com, who are our mortal enemies, but awritingroom.com. And there are 600 people there. And they are editing each other's stuff, and they are giving honest answers like, I think this is incredible. I'm not sure that I would try to publish it right now. I think I would wait. Or I think they would say, we both had editors that say, I think you wrote this to get it out of your system. But if you're in a collective, like a writing room, or you're at a junior college, or you're in one of your classes, I think you write it and then you figure out, because otherwise it's just paralyzing, I mean, I was going to say, when I'm on the first or second page of anything I write, I'm thinking about how the critics are going to receive it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that that's totally normal. I think that's just what I think that's just what we do. It's holding a mirror up, and we also live in a world now where everyone can be instantly published. I mean, that's where we are. Whether it's Substack or I have friends on Substack, very well-known writers who engage editors to review their work before they hit the publish button. And I don't do that, but I will write my essays and then I'll step away and then I'll come back. But when I absolutely agree with you, I mean, when a student is thinking that far ahead, what are people going to think? What are people going to say? How are the critics going to receive it? And invariably, I have to say to them, how much of it do you have written? And they'll say, 2 pages.
Yeah.
2 pages. Do you have an agent? No. Are you signed to a contract? No. And that, which is not to say that doesn't also happen when you do have an agent. You are signed to a contract. But it's like, that's a giant hurdle. That's really quicksand, is focusing on what, the critics, what the world is going to think before it's putting the cart before the horse, where really what should be happening is you should be focusing on the craft of the thing and creating the shitty first draft and understanding who your characters are, because I maintain that even in memoir, these are characters. Your narrator who represents you is also a character. You have to understand who they are. You have to get into the sort of the guts of the story. And you have to be able to do that with sort of a clear mind. You can't be thinking of, is it going to be wrapped in a rom-com cover? Is it going to be a comedy? Is it going to be, one of my students designed her own cover before the book was written.
Yeah.
And, and of course, Susan, my wife, is a book designer, and she's like, no, don't do that. Please don't do that. But I feel like that's just human nature. That's human nature.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have another reading picked out for us?
Yeah. Yes. Sure. Good. Yeah. So this is from a chapter called "The Choice to Create." We are the storytelling species. We make art to metabolize and clarify experience, to find the truth, to make meaning. We are the crafters and sharers of narrative. We are the yarn spinners and the myth makers, the truth tellers, the searchers. We write, we paint, we sculpt, we sing, we make music to make sense of our lives and to create order where there is disorder. As Robert Macfarlane writes in Underland, it was the earliest humans who held their hands up against the wall of a cave in Spain and spat out a mouthful of red ochre dust to form a handprint that said, "This is my story. I was here. Remember me." Our stories bump up against the stories of others. Unless we are living in seclusion or in a nunnery or in a cave on a mountain in Tibet, our lives are inevitably intertwined and linked. They overlap like the intersection on a Venn diagram. Interdependence is defined by the Buddhists as being profoundly connected, and it is the nature of reality and of human life. None of us lives in a vacuum. Our existence overlaps with and depends upon the existence of others. If it is human nature to mold and shape the truth, then what is the difference between truth and fact? How do they touch issues of ownership and permission? The psychiatrist and trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk spoke on Krista Tippett's On Being about the concept of individual truth. Put 5 adults around a table and ask them what happened on Christmas in 1978 when Daddy got drunk on the Jim Beam, and they'll all tell you a different version of the story, including Daddy didn't drink. Each of those is a version of the truth as seen through the lens of each sibling's experience, and each is therefore valid, but there can only be one empirical fact. Siblings will fight tooth and nail to prove that their truth is the truth and the only real and therefore valid one. But truth is always filtered through the passage of time, through one's eyes, through one's worldview. The act of writing memoir or personal narrative can be terrifying, and I am sorry to say these feelings do not ever abate. At best, we learn to live with them, cope with them, excavate them, metabolize them. It is understood, although rarely elucidated, except quietly in whispered hushes and mostly in therapist offices, that much of the fear of writing memoir has to do with warnings so ancient that they have become embedded in our psyches. We might be called a liar, a fabricator, a falsifier of the truth. We may be told that the personal essay we've written comes from a grudge. You really hated that third cousin once removed, and so you decided to tell the story about why she was sent away for a while when you were teenagers. We may be told that it's just about revenge. Your mother was so hideously cruel to you that you've decided to write about her so that everyone knows she's not the perfect church lady everyone thinks she is, and now she's too old to fight back. Or that abusive guy you were briefly involved with in the 90s is going to show up again in a dream sequence involving his getting drunk at an office party, and even though you've changed his name, likeness, and job, he will likely recognize himself. After writing her then shocking and revelatory memoir about her relationship with J.D. Salinger, At Home in the World, Joyce Maynard was called everything from self-absorbed to a hanger-on to, in the Washington Post, incredibly stupid, in spite of Salinger's withering and predatory treatment of his former student, who in 1972 left a full scholarship at Yale as a freshman to live with him when she was 18 and he 53. When Paul Theroux documented his friendship gone sour with his mentor, V.S. Naipaul, it was said to not be revenge, but just an examination of the arc of a literary friendship. Maynard, however, made the choice to tell her story and received, and continues to receive, so much vitriol over the book that she, in her own words, might as well have killed Holden Caulfield himself. But whoever we are, and however seasoned we are in the work we do, a large component of this fear of writing comes from shame. Together, fear and shame will conspire to quash creativity at every step, and they will if we allow them to. How do fear and shame play a role in making the choice to write? What happens if we ask permission to write a particular story and that permission is denied? Imagine this scenario. Dear X, may I write a memoir documenting your abusive treatment of me as a child? How many vital stories are not being told, memoirs written, movies made, art made, souls healed because of fear and shame? I'll stop there.
Amazing. I love this book. So
Thank you.
Last question. It's been a decade since you were excised from your family of origin for telling a century-old story in your first memoir about your grandmother. How did you transcend the pain of that loss and refocus it on the question of, is this mine to tell? How have time, distance, and context allowed you to move forward in telling important stories and that have enabled you to become such a vocal champion of the need for storytelling, especially now?
I think the answer to the first part of that question is how did I get past it or get through it or transcend it? A lot of therapy, a lot of therapy, a lot of very good friends, a lot of other writers, trusted writers with whom I spend time, who knew the story. Um, and I think that the benefit of um, time often equals distance, and I've written about this over and over again, not necessarily for publication. I have written in my notebooks about it. I have written essays about it. I wrote an essay about it for Krista Tippett's blog back in 2016. That was the very first time that I ever spoke of it, in any kind of a public way. And that was sort of like the little chisel, and the
Mm-hmm.
window opening just a little bit. And I described what had happened, but I described what happened in the context of other possible scenarios and other stories that other writers had told me.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, I was able to move back and move back and move back and see really what had happened over the course, of a very difficult, very painful decade.
Mm-hmm.
um, there was so much came out of those 8 lines, that it was almost hard for me to get my arms around it. And that was something that I do not really wish on any writer, seasoned or otherwise. But to be able to get through the story, and certainly in writing this book, I was able to take a big step back and see it for what it was, and to really grieve the loss of these people, and to grieve the relationship, that I'd had with them, and to also realize that that was still my story to tell.
Yeah.
And when I was able to say those words, that put me in a different place. That put me in
Mm-hmm.
a different place.
Mm-hmm.
And also, writing about it for the first time, in any length in this book, I was able to also look at those characters, at the people who took such offense at what I'd written,
Mm-hmm.
and really see who they were, and maybe how they got to that place. We have a huge issue with perfection in my family.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked about for a long time, and I know you've written about
Mm-hmm.
perfection being
Mm-hmm.
just it's a shackle. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's terrible, and it sort of dehumanizes us.
Mm-hmm.
And when I realized who they were, and that they are good people who were just profoundly hurt. They were blindsided, and they were bringing to the table a story that they either did, on one of them knew about it, and the rest of them didn't. But my aunt was told never to tell it, never to tell it, and her
Mm-hmm.
children, upheld that. And
Mm-hmm.
so I respect that, and I feel a great deal of responsibility for that. And it was my story to tell, and I had to tell it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I
Yeah.
want to close with one one of my very, very favorite paragraphs from this book. And I want to urge people to go get permission. I mean, go get permission is the main thing, but I really think Motherland is a perfect and exhilarating memoir. And if people haven't read any of the memoirs before, I'd really start with Motherland. It is
Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful memoir. So respect the story that you carry with you in your heart that you must tell. Understand that no one will give you permission to write it. Instead, listen to what the story has to reveal to you. Quiet the noise around you. Soften its pitch. Our deepest stories are our best teachers. Let the weapons of the weak, the poison, the nagging, the gossip, burn themselves to ash. Cast them to the wind. Take back the permission to tell your story and to succeed at it. Make it yours. So I want to thank our engineer, Risa Keene, who's part of awritingroom.com. And I want to thank everybody that came tonight and listened so attentively and stayed with us this whole hour. And especially I want to thank you, Elissa, for writing just such a profound exhortation for people to tell their truth, to tell the stories that want to be written, that they alone can tell. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, that means the world to me coming from you. And I'm really grateful for everyone who came tonight to hear us. And we are, as I said, as Robert McFarlane, to quote Robert McFarlane, we are the storytelling species. That is what we do. That is what makes us human.
Yeah.
Please tell your stories. Please, please, please.
Please, please, please. So. Now more than ever.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you and good night, everybody.
Good night.